Co-main event time, and we're going to our first women's title match of 2022. And of the title fights which are planned, it's arguably one of the most intriguing. It's Rose Namajunas who is defending her belt up against Carla Esparza. Now, this is a title fight which, in my opinion, and this is purely based on storylines, it's arguably one of the best stories that the UFC have done. So I'll give people a little bit of history lesson here. 2014, in December, the UFC crowned their first ever strawweight champion on the 20th season of Tough. So we have Carla Esparza, reigning Invicta champion, taking on Rose Namajunas, who's like 21 years old, has a 2-1 record. Carla wins that fight, third round submission, and from that point on, she suffers a few, she goes on a bit of a lull. Like, she loses Joanna in quite comprehensive fashion, falls down the rankings, and most people think, you're just a relic, you're just this one-dimensional wrestler, and all of these evolved strikers are going to piece you apart. Out of nowhere, she goes on this second wind, 5 straight victories, beats a truckload of unbeaten, flashier knockout artists, and just slowly grinds her way back into the title picture. And the person waiting for her in this title fight is the girl she beat 8 years earlier. That to me is a fantastic story.
Yeah, I agree. Very, very well written story. I mean, obviously it's not written, but it seems like a WWE type of story, right? Where like the rematches happen in 8 years down the road, and there's actually a good story behind it. And I think it's very intriguing. I think Rose has rose to a really high popularity. She's getting wide mainstream recollection, I'd say, for her past few wins. Obviously, the big head kick over Joanna. The crowd was very behind her in the New York City decision that she got over Zhang as well. So I think Rose has risen to a pretty high popularity, and Carla has kind of stayed, a little underrated. She's been the underdog in several of her fights. She was the underdog to Yan Shannon, who she just absolutely demolished, took her down, ground and pounded her, kept her down, just bell to bell domination from Carla Esparza there. And it's a good possibility that Carla Esparza is at her best that she's ever been, even though she's had the longer career. She's the veteran in this matchup. And there's no doubt that Rose is at her best of her career, but I think Carla could still be operating at her best. And she's gotten a lot better along these years. So, I mean, it's a really intriguing matchup.
And I think as well, from Rose's perspective, we talked about Carla's side of this story. Rose has a pretty good one as well. Like, obviously, in that first fight, that was like a 4th pro fight when she fought for the belt. And you could see that she had a lot of potential, very talented, but incredibly green. And in the 8 years since, we've seen her mature and evolve into, as you mentioned before, a popular, well-regarded champion who has beaten every other strawweight champion in the division's history, except Carla Esparza. So there's that element of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's their last piece of the puzzle. She'll get her revenge, and then she'll have a win over every strawweight champion, which is quite the accomplishment too. So, yeah, it's quite the matchup, quite the story. I think it's happening at the right time. I think you and I were pretty vocal about criticizing the UFC for giving Zhang a rematch, but after we saw their second fight, and it ended up being a close decision. 2 rounds to two, 1 round decides the fight, one moment decides the fight. It was a really close decision. Zhang made a good account of herself, and I think that was a pretty deserving rematch after all things were said and done. So I'm glad we got to see the rematch, and now I'm glad Rose won, obviously, and now we get to see the real rematch between Esparza and Rose that everyone's looking forward to.
Why do you think the UFC have been so reluctant to go with the Carl of Sparta rematch? Because we've mentioned before how great the story is from both ladies' perspective, yet for the longest time the UFC seemed very hesitant to actually go ahead and give Carla the title fight. It reminds me a little bit of what happened with Damian Maia, where for the longest time they really hesitated on giving him the shot at Tyron Woodley, and then eventually just had to give in and say, okay, here you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense from like a business perspective. Carla isn't extremely popular. She's not particularly exciting as a personality or in the cage. I mean, she is a wrestler. She is looking to get the fight to the ground and grind things to a halt. So that's not the most exciting style. Rose is more of a dynamic striker who can mix in the grappling. So I understand why And then she's also just like not that great looking of a woman too, which does play into some things. But she's gonna be looking awfully good on Saturday night with that belt wrapped around her waist, I gotta say. Um, and yeah, I'll be cheering for Carla. So I'll pass it back to you before I get into my analysis of the actual matchup.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, I think this fight is going to come down to the wrestling. And because I think we all know the way that the Carla Esparza game plan works these days, which is going for the takedown. It's okay if you don't really do all that much when you're on top. As long as you keep control, which Carla has always been very, very good at, you're able to just grind out these decisions. And it almost sort of reminds me a little bit of Glover versus Yarn, where I even said before that fight that that could very well come down to what happens in that first takedown. If Glover is able to get Yarn down without any sort of issue, he has a very good chance of winning the fight. And I feel the same way. If Carla can get the first takedown on Rose and keep her there, she more than has the confidence to get two more. And she only needs three in theory to win this fight. But if Rose is able to stuff that first takedown or get back to her feet, we could see Carla go into herself. Obviously, we saw what happened against Joanna. Carla actually got the takedown very early on against Joanna, but once she got back to her feet, you could see her body language sort of say, well, what do I do now? She's got back to her feet. Wrestling was my only way of winning this fight, and she got pieced up. And we could very well see the same thing happen if Rose is able to get back to her feet and tee off on her.
Yeah, so I'll actually slightly disagree with that there about because I think it's more than just about the first takedown. Because if you go back and watch their first fight from 2014, Carlo did get a few early takedowns there, and I think Rose was able to stand up relatively quickly from the first two or three takedowns. But in halfway through round two, you saw Rose kind of settle on bottom, go full guard, and that's when she finally got stuck on bottom, and that's when her confidence kind of evaporated, and that's where the momentum really started to take over for Carla. So I don't think it's going to come down to necessarily the first takedown. I think it'll be, I mean, I'm really interested to see what type of strategy Rose uses once she gets taken down, because I have very little doubt in my mind that she will be taken down in this fight. It's just a matter of can she get back up to her feet, or does she settle in that full guard and lay on her back for a few minutes? And based on the early wrestling success that Zhang had in their rematch, I actually hadn't remembered this until I rewatched the fight last night that Zhang had a lot of success with her wrestling early on in that fight. And, Zhang is not really a traditional wrestler. She maybe had a few upper body clinch takedowns in the UFC so far, but she wasn't really known for shooting on the legs, shooting a double, a single. And she did that in that fight several times and, looked good doing so, got Rose down to the mat. And even in round three of that fight, don't forget that Zhang got a takedown, she got a back take, and then she transitioned to mount right at the end of the round there. So, I mean, Zhang was in mount landing strikes, and if another 30, 60 seconds happened there on top, we could have saw Zhang finish that fight on top there. So I can't stress enough how close that Zhang versus Rose fight was. Zhang won rounds 1 and 3 clearly. Rose won 4 and 5 clearly. Round two is the deciding round, and what happened earlier in the round was Zhang hurt her with a punch, and then Rose got a late takedown at the end of the round to kind of steal the round back. But if that happened opposite, say Rose hit an early takedown in the round and then Zhang hurt her with a punch at the end of the round, the judges would have certainly given that one to Zhang. So I mean, that fight really came down to 30, 60 seconds of time in that round two, where Rose stole it. So that fight was so close, and I think that Rose has still showed a lot of susceptibility to getting taken down in that fight, which I think really favors Carla and us Carla fans on Saturday night.
I was very concerned with the poor takedown defense that Rose showed in that fight, especially bearing in mind, yes, Whaley was training with Cejudo, so obviously wrestling was almost expected to be a part of her arsenal. Do you think that maybe sort of played a part in Rose's performance against Whaley, that maybe she wasn't prepared for the wrestling heavy game that she had? Whereas this time around, we know what Carla's going to be doing. We know it's going to be very wrestling heavy, and she's going to be a little bit prepped a little bit better than she maybe would have done for Whaley.
Yeah, I do think a little bit was like an element of surprise. But still, the reactions that she showed once she got taken down, I think were still pretty poor, and that's what's going to translate to this matchup. Even if she knows Carla is coming to take her down, it's about what she shows on the ground after she gets taken down. And I saw enough weaknesses against Zhang that that I still have reason to believe that Carla can win here. But if I'm Rose and Rose's coaches, I'm literally only wrestling for this fight, like in terms of a training camp. Like there's no doubt about it that Rose is the better striker than Carla. Carla really not too effective on the feet. I mean. She should stay. Rose should stay sharp with her striking and everything, but she really needs to focus like 80-90% of her time on wrestling because that's what this fight comes down to. It is about defensive wrestling, and it really comes down to Rose's strategy too. Because if she comes out with that same nonchalant, relaxed, she feels her opponent's out, she stays at range, she looks to pick her punches. That's going to allow Carla to bring the pressure to her and to get those takedowns. But if Rose comes out aggressive and high volume like she did against Andrade in the first fight down in Brazil, remember Rose came out like a bat out of hell in that fight, landing nasty punches, showing off her really good boxing. So if Rose comes out aggressive, gets in Carla's face and starts landing punches, we could be in trouble. But if she comes out with that same boring or nonchalant type of style where she's picking her strikes, then I think Carla could get her down.
And also as well, I have noticed with Carla Esparza is when you start putting the pressure on her, she doesn't like it. Like obviously everyone brings up Joanna, but also Alexa Grasso in the third round. When Carla failed with a couple of takedown attempts, Grasso started raiding her, and that could have very easily been a 10-8 round for Grasso in round 3 of that fight.
Yeah, she does. She does do that, and she can maybe slow down a little bit in round three, um, after she wrestles hard for a few rounds. So I'm concerned about the later rounds as a Carla fan here. I think that she has a great chance to win the first one, two, maybe even three rounds. But those last 2 to 3 rounds are going to favor Rose. Rose has been in 5 round fights. She was in a tough back and forth with Joanna. She was in a tough back and forth with Zhang, where she pulled out some big late rounds in those fights. So I think that the 5 round and cardio advantage definitely goes to Rose, but that doesn't mean that Carla can't get out to a 3-0 lead with her takedowns
Mm.
here. So look out for that.
Yeah. What sort of threat do you think Rose offers off her back? Because there is a big possibility that Carla is going to be able to get the takedowns, possibly hold her down there. Because I'd make an argument that one of the big tipping points in the Weili fight was Rose's ability off her back, because she was landing elbows, she was trying for submissions, and when Rose was taking Weili down by comparison, Weili seemed a lot more content to just sit there and ride out the round.
Yeah, I don't think she offers much of a threat off her back, but I don't see why Rose could possibly get on top here. If she maybe shoots her own takedown, I think she should get on, or she could get on top here. Um, she's not a bad wrestler of her own right. So I definitely think that Rose has more ways to win the fight. That's why she is the favorite. She's a deserved favorite here. She can win via striking. She can win, with her cardio. She might even be able to get on top. While Carla, her wins needs a takedown. I mean, multiple takedowns and Carla win is directly correlated. She really cannot win without multiple takedowns. So I mean, it's she's the rightful underdog here, but I'm still going to trust and pick her as the underdog. I mean, I think the odds are currently like plus 165, which is like 37%. I mean, Carla already beat her. Is looking. She hasn't slowed down one bit, right? She's still winning fights against tough competition. Rose still shows some defensive wrestling weaknesses. So I just don't understand why Carla is a 37% underdog, when I think the writing is on the wall that she should be more like 45% or something like that. So I would give her the slightest of underdogs, but I'll still be picking Carla, the Cookie Monster, to get it done. I'll go with 48-47 decision.
Should we read anything into the fact that Rose is unbeaten in rematches?
No, because if everyone knows that if Andrade's rematch was a 5 round fight, that she would have lost that fight. And then the Joanna fight that comes down to a takedown in the last 30 seconds of round five. And the Zhang fight, it comes down to a 30-second takedown in round two. It's not like she's blowing these women out of the water. She's literally winning by a tiny, tiny thread. She won a 29-28 split over Andrade, and then she won a split decision over Zhang, and then she won unanimous, but still really close decision against Joanna. So I don't think that number means too much.
Normally, I play quite safe when it comes to my predictions. We're going to have a new UFC strawweight champion. I'm in the same boat as you. I can see Carla Esparza grinding out a decision here.
Let's go, Cookie Monster. I'll pick her. I'll pick her to win rounds 1, 2, and 4. Like she'll win the first two. She'll take a little bit of time off in round 3. The tide is gonna look like it's turning, but then Carla will go right back to winning in round 4 and secure that decision.